Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And let me first of all welcome you all to NIPSIA, to Carleton University. NIPSIA is a few blocks further up, but I am the director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. My name is Teddy Sami, for those of you who don't know me. Pour ceux qui ne me connaissent pas, mon nom est Teddy Sami. Je suis le directeur de la Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, aussi connu comme NIPSIA, ici à l'Université Carleton. Donc bonjour et bienvenue à cette conférence sur le développement en période d'instabilité géopolitique. J'aimerais avant tout reconnaître que le campus de l'Université Carleton est situé sur le territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe, présente en ces lieux depuis des temps immémoriaux. NIPSIA is, of course, very pleased to partner with CAIDP, the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals, for this conference on development cooperation in a time of geopolitical instability. This is a timely and at the same time long overdue meeting. We're glad that it's happening now. As some of you would have heard last night when we had the pre-kickoff event, we are slowly getting into an electoral cycle in Canada, which makes it interesting. But more importantly, I think we have certainly all seen how difficult it's been the last few years. We are certainly living through very difficult times. We've had a global pandemic. Many countries are still trying to recover from it around the world, and developing countries were particularly hit very hard by the pandemic. There are debt crises in many developing countries. There are funding issues with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're already halfway through Agenda 2030, and by all accounts, we will miss many of the targets and objectives that were set in 2015. In fact, in some cases, we're going backwards, and I think this is really problematic for many developing countries. We, of course, have to deal with climate-related challenges. These are becoming more and more frequent. We're asking developing countries to spend on climate while at the same time meeting their Sustainable Development Goals, while at the same time fighting debt crises, while at the same time these countries are also over-indebted and can't borrow anymore. So it's a combination of many things that make it very difficult for developing countries and even developed countries to get through. So it is a really difficult time. And on top of this, what we've also seen in recent years is an increase in conflicts around the world and geopolitical shifts. And that's what many observers, academics have referred to as a polycrisis. So we are right in the middle of it. It is indeed the right time, I think, to think about the implications of geopolitical instability on development cooperation. And that's why we're here. We have a great program over 2 days, today and tomorrow. In a few minutes, we'll have the pleasure of hearing from the Honorable Robert Ray, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the UN, for the plenary keynote address on policymaking in a time of crises. We will have several breakout sessions over the next 2 days, a few keynote speakers, a networking reception this afternoon, and also a conversation with Global Affairs Canada tomorrow afternoon. So in closing, what I want to do is thank NIPSIA staff, the admin staff, Anne Morneau, Alison Fitch, my assistant, the members of the conference committee who have worked tirelessly in the last few months to get this program set up, our student volunteers who are here and over the next 2 days for the help that they will provide. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being here today on a very cold day. It's supposed to warm up this afternoon, so let's just wait and see. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the next 2 days. I think it will be great to hear from all of you, and I will be taking notes and listening to what people have to say. I'd like to invite Bart Edesh, who's a member of the board of CAIDP, to say a few words. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. As Teddy just mentioned, and thank you, Teddy, I'm Bart Edesh from the board of CAIDP, speaking on behalf of the membership in the board today. I'm also serving as a professor of practice at the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University, and welcome to those coming from Montreal and Quebec. We are about to introduce our keynote speaker. So I'll be very brief here. And then after the keynote address, I'll have a couple of remarks to help guide you through the program today and find things like bathrooms that you'll need to find. So I'll turn immediately to introduce the person who will introduce the ambassador, and that is Fida Jaja, who is the Chief Program Officer of CoWater. CoWater is one of our sponsors today, and you will see on posters around the site today the list of sponsors. Please give it some attention because this event would not be possible without the support of the sponsors, as well as the key partnership of our host, NIPSIA. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. It's wonderful to see so many colleagues gathered here and online, I assume, for what is truly a landmark event for the Canadian international development sector. Our commitment as a country and as a development community to support the most vulnerable and marginalized, fight for social justice, gender equality, and social inclusion, and lay the foundation for more resilient and sustainable development path should be matched by our equal drive for innovation, localization, and effective partnerships. This morning, I have the distinct honor of introducing Ambassador Bob Rae, who summarizes so eloquently what Canada stands for in our efforts to build a fairer, more peaceful, and more prosperous world. In his own words, as a country that is less than a superpower, Canada cannot rely on its muscle to make itself heard. Our influence comes from a capacity for wisdom, from being a trusted source of information, knowledge, and judgment on some of the most difficult issues facing the world. A respected voice across the political, development, and humanitarian sectors, both in Canada and abroad. Ambassador Bob Rae's decades-long career has been established and dedicated to building a better world. Prior to his appointment as Canada's representative to the UN in 2020, Ambassador Rae served in important diplomatic roles as Canada's envoy for Myanmar and envoy for humanitarian and refugee issues, addressing a wide range of humanitarian crises around the world. A strong advocate for Indigenous rights, education, governance, and human rights, Ambassador Rae's impact across 35 years of federal and provincial politics, including as Premier of Ontario and interim leader of the Liberal Party, has shaped generations of Canadian leaders. Ambassador Rae is Privy Councillor, a companion of the Order of Canada, and a member of the Order of Ontario, and has numerous awards and honorary degrees from institutions in Canada and around the world. In addition to a remarkable career in politics, diplomacy, and legal practice, he taught at the University of Ottawa in the School of Public Policy and Governance, in the Faculty of Law, and at Massey College and Victoria University, and he was a Fellow of the Forum of Federation, Massey College, and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. In his own words, he describes a vision for Canada at home and abroad. I see a Canada that is determined to increase the franchise of its citizens and that is at the forefront of expanding the rights of its people across the globe. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to pass the floor to Ambassador Bob Rae for his reflections on Canada's role in expanding the rights of people across the globe in this time of profound geopolitical instability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to join you from our office here in New York, from the Canadian Mission. I've been given the rather daunting task of being your keynote speaker and of taking up as much as 40 minutes of your time. as my staff will certainly tell you, that's a very dangerous thing for you to do because I, I, uh, I have a lot on my mind these days, and I have a lot that I'd like to say. So I will take full advantage of your being there, uh, and uh, and hope you'll be able to find the bathrooms after I've spoken. So uh, what I thought I'd do is give you a bit of a chronology or a historical background, not going back into distant history, which is equally interesting to do, but really starting in 1945 and then taking us to where we are today and some of the challenges that we face. I hope there'll be enough time for me to speak a little bit about some of the things we need to be thinking about going forward. My basic message is yes, of course, it's a serious time. It's a difficult moment in human history for a whole number of reasons. But that's no reason for us to give up. These are the times we live in. We don't live in any other. And so we have to take up our responsibilities seriously as we go forward. And I think there's every reason for us to believe that there are, in fact, some solutions and steps that we can take to deal with the challenges we face. It's just that it's proving hard to do, but we have to keep trying to do it. So let's start in 1945. The world was devastated and traumatized by the effects of what was up until that time the most serious complex. Are we having trouble with sound? I see a sound sign coming on. I hope not. Um, anyway, I'll just keep talking, and if somebody cuts me off, that'll be an indication that yes, indeed, we're having trouble with sound. So it's important to remember that a highly colonized, imperialized world came out of a global conflict with a deep sense of trauma, and yet also a deep sense of how we couldn't let that happen again. Although arguably we are at risk of doing so, but we need to, I think, reflect on the seriousness of the effort that was made in the years after the war to try to rebuild institutions and ways of working with each other that would allow for human development and the extension of sovereignty and democracy to come to the fore. Essentially creating the institution itself of the United Nations. Very shortly thereafter, the institutions we refer to now as the Bretton Woods institutions, which is the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which are based in Washington. And then a few years later, other regional security institutions, which were really intended to deal with the other legacy of 1945, which is that while Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were defeated and their allies, there was a growing conflict between the Soviet Union and its the allies they effectively controlled, and those countries that aspired to greater democracy and to freer economies in the West. So that's the structure that we had that took us through this process of decolonization, which really began shortly after the war with the sovereignty of India and Pakistan, and subsequently the emergence into self-government, whether we call it democracy or not, but political independence and sovereignty of a number of countries. But I think it's one of the themes of my thinking is that the legacy of empire is still with us. And it's a mistake to think that the process of decolonization, which essentially was a political process of saying to countries, okay, here you go, you're now independent, so that we've moved from being a United Nations of 53 countries to United Nations of 193 countries, with a very, very tiny number of geographical states that are actually still either controlled or part of the governance of another country. And it's important to recognize that the consequences of empire, which was a process of time that went on for hundreds of years prior to 1945, is a process that we're still trying to understand. We talk a lot about decolonizing ourselves in Canada. We're not quite sure what that means or how we do it, but nevertheless, I think we're right to be talking about it for the first time. And that, I think, is an important set of issues that we need to understand lie underneath a lot of the debates that we're seeing today at the United Nations, and that are, in fact, behind many of the conflicts which are dominating our world. It was also and we're moving forward, if you'll follow my thinking, through a period of Cold War competition with the Iron Curtain going across Europe, and the USSR and the United States and its allies seeing the rest of the world and the developing world as a theater of competition. That really, I think, provides some of the security background to the early debates around development and why development was possible. In Canada, we sold development in the 50s and early 60s, not only as the right thing to do because countries were poor and had been left behind, and because, frankly, imperial structures had done them no favors in terms of their overall economic development. But it was also a way of pursuing our interest in human security and democracy, and yes, withstanding the impact of aggression from other countries. We could see the debate intensifying at this time at the UN about the nature of the world that developing countries were in. Their insistence that the institutions which the rich countries had created in 1945, the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, didn't work for them and were not up to helping them. Therefore, they felt they needed to use the UN itself as a place where their voices could be heard more effectively in the General Assembly and in a number of agencies which were given the responsibility for advancing the cause of human development. In particular, the most long-standing one, which is the International Labor Organization in Geneva, the World Health Organization based in Geneva, UNICEF, which is based in New York, and eventually the United Nations Development Program, which was really a conglomeration of a number of efforts which the UN itself was making with money from advanced economies like Canada. And that's really where this debate was happening as to, well, how do we get countries to improve their situation? What is the most effective way to respond to their development needs, but also what is the most effective way to respond to their humanitarian needs? Because natural disasters, conflicts, and the spread of pandemics created many situations where there were serious humanitarian situations to which the world had to respond by making sure people had enough food to eat and making sure they had an ability to get an education and to have their health improved. A couple of developments during this time that I think have still linger in our debates here. One of them was Mr. Pearson's famous report. Mr. Pearson was a teacher at Carleton before he passed away. And while he was at Carleton, he wrote a very famous report together with others for the World Bank on the need to make progress on international development, and suggested that countries like Canada should be spending as much as 0.7% of our GDP on development, a target which we have never met and which we are far from meeting today. At the same time, one has to admit that the process of development that followed on from the Pearson report owed less to ODA and a lot more to countries' determination, countries like India, like China, countries' determination to develop and create wealth themselves in a way that would allow them to take better care of their people. And the industrialization process in the developing world the creation of wealth has come with great advantages. The lifting out of poverty of literally billions of people, far more than I think anybody anticipated was even remotely possible in 1970, and the transformation of the global economy into what we see now, which is very, very, very different from the economy that we had in 1945 or that we had in 1970 or even in 1990. An economy where India, China, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, Mexico, many other countries that are large, have large populations, and are rapidly industrializing, are moving from a situation where most of their people were poor to a situation where there are still many of their people poor, but many of their people are also middle class and doing better and getting a piece of the action in terms of prosperity. From a UN policy point of view, we moved from the millennial goals, which were intended to deal with the needs of those countries that were furthest behind, to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the world we're living in today, starting in 2015, where the UN debated for 2 or 3 years, well, what are the goals that apply not just to one group of countries or to a small group of people, but apply to the whole world? What are the sustainable development goals that actually unite rich and poor countries, median income, lower income, small island developing states, landlocked developing states, all of the various categories of development which we've set up, and what are the goals that will bring us together? So as you all know, they're the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I call it common sense for the world, because the goals that are being established, dramatic reduction in poverty, making sure everybody has access to schooling and education, improving people's health care, all the way up through dealing with effectively with climate change and the health of the planet, to issues of governance, human rights, and social justice. All of these things are brought together in a very ambitious and comprehensive program, which, as was stated from the platform, the world is not meeting. Well, why not? Well, one of the reasons is because of this, what I call legacy of empire, which is a legacy of inequality, a legacy of racism and discrimination, and a failure to address the human development needs of the countries which were being colonized and taken over from the 15th century right through to the 20th century. The second, of course, is the extent of the impact of climate change, which we now realize is a crisis of a different order from things that we have faced before, because it's a crisis of the planet itself, and it is a huge challenge for global communities, and we'll come back and assess how we're doing, but it is an enormous challenge, of which most people were not really aware until well into the 1980s and 1990s. The impact of the pandemic has been dramatic. It's the worst pandemic the world has faced since the flu of 1919. It's a pandemic, COVID, which has not brought the world together as effectively as it needed to. And all of the international institutions which we created after 1945, like the World Health Organization and others, were simply not able to get the supplies of vaccines to people quickly enough in a way that would ensure that people could get through it. Tens of millions of people died as a result of COVID. It is still prevalent. People are still getting it. People are still dying from it. But rather than bringing the world together, it also showed, in a sense, how divided we still are. Is an expression that, a rising tide lifts all boats. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't lift all boats equally. And the rising tide of the response to the COVID pandemic was not able to overcome the deep inequality that has still bedevils the global economy. The third I think surprise and tragedy for the world is that we've now returned. We're not returning. We are there now to a world of conflict, and it's not just a conflict of ideas. It's a conflict of war. It's a kinetic conflict, as we call it. It's a country where people get killed. People are killing each other in large numbers, and where in the case of Russia and Ukraine, it's a classic war of aggression. In the case of many of the conflicts we see, it's driven not only by governments fighting with each other, but within countries. You have armed gangs, you have large scale international criminal organizations on a level we have never, ever seen before that are having a devastating impact on the drug trade and on creating higher and more significant levels of conflict. A good example of this is Haiti. Another example of this is Ecuador. But it's something I feel very strongly is something we're going to be seeing and dealing with a lot more of, and understanding that the great drug struggles of the past, like the Opium War of the 19th century, were also had huge elements of corruption and criminal elements that were directing the policies of the empires that were responsible for them and creating the situation. So we have increased conflict, we have increased displacement, we have more people living who have been displaced from their homes than we've seen since long for decades. We have not only regular migration, which is a natural way in which the human flow happens in the world, but we also see massive displacement, which is involuntary, which is forced, which is creating refugees at a level and number we haven't seen before. We have a digital divide where the new digital revolution, which is transforming the global economy, instead of bringing us all together, able equally to take advantage of these new technologies, is actually dividing countries between those who are able to take advantage and those who are not able to take advantage. So those who are falling further behind. As has been mentioned, we have debt crisis because countries are not able to deal with the level of human need on the basis of development assistance. It's far from adequate to enable them to do that. They borrow money, and just as in Canada, people go from borrowing money from banks to borrowing money from their credit card to then borrowing money from loan sharks and becoming completely overwhelmed by debt. Countries are facing, many developing countries are facing a similar problem. They're taking on debt they can't afford, and it's driving them to seek more and more extreme measures in order to get money, and creating problems not only of liquidity, but just simply countries that are no longer able to function and are going bankrupt. The governance structures that we face to deal with these problems are not working well. At the UN, we're bedeviled by the extent of the use of the veto in the Security Council. You will have seen another example of that this week. We are facing a crisis of a financial crisis at the UN, again, not widely understood. The UN can't borrow money, so if countries are not paying their dues, the United States has not been paying its dues for the last while. China is slow in paying its dues. Many countries are not paying their dues. As a result, the UN doesn't have the money it needs to do its job. And then there's this debate at the UN that I think is really one of the central issues of our time, which is, do we think that democracy and human rights are universal values, or don't we? The UN Charter says they are. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in 1948, says they are. We've created a Human Rights Council and a human rights monitoring structure globally, which says they are. But there are an increasing number of countries which say, no, we don't feel that these Western ideas should tell us what to do. And so there's now a polarization that we're seeing at a level that is not unique in the sense of we've faced it before. We had a dramatic polarization in the world between communist and non-communist. We've seen polarization between highly developed economies and economies that are not doing well, people that are living in conditions of wealth and opulence, people that are living in conditions of great poverty. So polarization is not a new thing, but it's taking on a new form at the UN, a form that is very potentially dramatic and potentially dangerous, because the countries that are taking sides, as it were, many of them are nuclear fueled and nuclear powered. So we really need to understand and appreciate that what President Kennedy once referred to as the sword of Damocles, which is the sword that's hanging up over our heads, can drop on us at any time. And we need to understand that we're not living in an age of nuclear security either. So we can't control what North Korea does. We can't control what other countries are thinking about doing. There's the potential for a new nuclear arms race among a number of countries that have been holding back from fully developing the capacity to develop nuclear weapons. And I know that in the nice distinctions that we make between development and security, and say, well, that's not a development issue. Say, well, actually, it is a development issue because all these issues are tied together. The lack of peace, the lack of security, the growth of insecurity is making investment and long-term commitments to countries more difficult. And we see that everywhere. We see how these things are connected, which is why at the UN we talk about peace and human rights and development as being part of a nexus of something that needs to connect everything we do in how we respond effectively to the world. There's one last problem that I want to talk about because I think it really is a significant one for us in Canada and for many, many other highly developed economies. And that is that when it comes to domestic priorities, housing, cost of living, how we're doing, how the world is doing, how we're doing, how we feel about the world we're in. We have a government to go to say, these are the priorities we want you to take seriously. And throughout human history, there's always been a challenge about how do we get countries that are living in nation states to care about what's going on in other places that are not us. We're Canadians. Why should I care what's happening in Bangladesh? Why should I care what's happening in some other country? I don't want my country's government caring more about somebody else than they're caring about me. I want my government to care about me. So this is not a new problem. It's interesting when you look back at our own history in Canada. We fought in the First World War because we felt we were obliged to fight for the British Empire. And because we felt we were part of the British Empire, we were an offshoot of the British Empire, and we owed it to defend the mother country of the British Empire from attacks from other countries, like Germany and so on. And many, many Canadians died in that conflict, mainly young men, but tens of thousands of young men were killed in that conflict. And when the war was over, which was devastating for our country in that sense, devastating from a human standpoint, not necessarily economically devastating, but certainly devastating from that point of view, there was a strong desire in the country to say, okay, forget that. we're not going to go back to worrying exclusively about Europe. Although one man, the prime minister, said, no, wait a minute, we have to play a role in the new institutions which are growing up. So he insisted on signing the League of Nations Treaty and insisted on having representation at the League of Nations, which was the precursor organization to the United Nations. And unfortunately, Robert Borden wasn't actually supported very much by his own government. And there are many examples one can point to where Canada avoided international obligations, like we're not getting involved. We're not doing that. We're not signing up for that anymore. Lo and behold, we signed up for World War II because we felt that that was something we could not avoid. Again, the tie with the empire was very strong. The tie with Britain was very strong. But there was also a sense that the values for which the world was fighting against Nazi aggression were values that we had to support, and our interest was there in supporting it. The challenge we face is it's one thing to say that's how you get into wars. How do you get into wars? You get into wars because you're persuaded that actually it's in your interest to do so. So in Ukraine, for example, I think many countries say, yeah, we're actually committed to stopping Russian aggression in Ukraine, and we think it would be a really bad thing if he was able to take over Ukraine again, as Russia did for several hundred years prior to the independence of Ukraine. It's harder, I think, to say, well, this is our fight. We say that and believe it. I happen to believe that it is in a significant way, but there's a division of opinion about that. How does this relate to development? Well, because in development, what we're really saying is it's in our interest to engage with other countries in helping them to develop, because it will build a more secure and prosperous world at one level. And secondly, in terms of humanitarian assistance, because if your neighbor is starving, you got to help them. Like, yeah, you got to help. You got to respond. You see people that are starving in different parts of the world, and they are in many conflicts that are not widely known, like Sudan, for example. Huge humanitarian mess in Sudan. Millions of people displaced from their homes. The capital city of Khartoum leveled by bombing and destruction. Well, what's our obligation? And increasingly, there are voices in Canada and in many other countries in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, saying, you know what, we really don't owe those people anything. They're responsible for their own mess. Let them clean it up, and we're not going to respond to that in the way that other times we might have thought we would. And that's really what we're seeing today. I think the problem we have today in Canadian politics is that the cause of international development doesn't have a strong and vocal enough constituency in Canada to persuade our governments that they have to play an even stronger role. And I believe that's a really big problem. And it's a really big deal, because it means that those who appeal to our sense of isolationism, or what a sense of selfishness, whatever it may be, takes different forms in different ways, and just saying, don't get involved, don't spend the money, don't invest, don't go to Haiti, don't do too much, don't do more than you have to do as little as possible. Those voices are at risk of winning out, and we have to understand what the consequences of that will be. Because the mistake that was made in the 1930s was to think that what happened in other countries really didn't affect us very much. And then it ended up affecting us a lot. And that's exactly the world that we're in again today. We might think that what happens in Haiti doesn't affect us, but the collapse of governments, the collapse of social structures, the massive increase in global insecurity makes for a more dangerous world and a more difficult world, and a world that is not one we should aspire to living in, and a world that we have to learn how to change. When we're asked the question, are we our brother's keeper? The answer is yes, we are. And it's not just because I have a moral obligation to do it. It's because I have a self-interested reason to do it. And we have to understand that people are often driven by self-interest and perhaps not by generosity or empathy or compassion or any of the emotions that we're trying to appeal to when we ask people to take international development seriously. I started, this talk talking about the impact that conflicts were having, the impact that empires were having. When you look at the conflicts that are happening today, it's important to realize how many of them are connected to arguments about empire and power itself. So that in Ukraine, it's the Russians are insisting that Ukraine is really like them. There really is no difference between Ukraine and us, and we are going to advance our interests in Ukraine because the Ukrainians are just like us. This is a holdover from the Russian Empire. It's the Russian Empire Part 2 that we're seeing acting out. In the Middle East, the conflict that has all of our attention right now between Israel and Hamas, that really is a product of a long historical debate about whether or not the Jewish people had a right to live in the Middle East, and whether or not they were as legitimate a presence in the Middle East as other countries. And Canada and I certainly feel yes, they do, but they have a right to live in a particular place that has borders and boundaries, and where others have rights to live in states as well. As Palestinians have a right to a state, and the Israelis have a right to a state, and two states have to be living side by side with defined borders and effective governments, and governments that can control law and order and a desire to say, well, no, we want to take over more of this part, or we want to take over more of that part, to keep those forces at bay, and to say, no, we're going to have responsible structures set up. And that's what we need to be continuing to work for and to fight for. But I think where the issue of why we need to care is perhaps most clearly demonstrated by what I call the global crises that are genuinely global and planetary. One of them is viruses. Why do we care about viruses? We care about viruses because viruses don't know anything about borders. They don't know anything about the world order that says all nation states are responsible for everything. Viruses don't care about nation states. Viruses cross borders without a passport. And we need to understand that's why we need to worry about viruses. It's because if you allow viruses to grow up in certain parts of the world and never to be fixed and never to be cured and never to be dealt with properly, they can always come back. So that argument is even stronger with climate change, because climate change is the product, this is what the science tells us, is the product of our having adopted the use of fossil fuels, initially coal, and then oil and natural gas, as the principal means by which we would drive our economic and industrial structures. The decision was made with the growth of the Industrial Revolution in England and then in Europe and then globally all around the world, to the point now where the whole world is hooked on fossil fuels as the principal driver of development. And yet we need to understand that in continuing down that path, we are threatening the health and life on the planet. It's that simple. and that we need to figure out a way to initially reduce this dependence and then get away from it in, entirely, in effect, to get to net zero so that we're not producing the emissions that are responsible for that layer of fog around that envelops the planet, that is changing the nature of our climate and creating the problems and havoc that we're seeing. I don't think there's a more difficult public policy challenge than climate change, because it requires all of us to come to grips with the institutional dependency that has been created over a very long period of time on fossil fuel. And getting rid of that dependency is not going to happen overnight, but it is going to require us to take steps, steady steps, that will get us to a place where we need to be. We call that the mitigation strategy. And then there's the adaptation strategy, which is how do we help those that are now being affected by climate change and will be even more affected by climate change in the years ahead. These are questions that know no boundaries, but the places where these decisions are effectively made are within nation states that have the power and the clout to do something about it. The difference between national law and international law is not a difference in kind or concept. Laws are laws. But the difference is in this issue of enforcement. And the trouble we have with international law, and this is perhaps an area in which I'll close, is that international law has high aspirations, but low levels of enforcement. And we have to realize this is a fatal weakness in the structure of our societies, that we don't give to international law the same strength of enforcement as we do our national laws. There's a great French philosopher, Pascal, who said something very simple, and that is justice without enforcement is impotent. But enforcement without justice is called tyranny. Now, he said that about 500 years ago, and it's still true. And we're still living with this contradiction. And this is the contradiction that we will all be living with for decades to come. Now, I'll be spending a few less decades with you than most of you, so I wish you well in this challenge, because it is a great one, and the work that you're doing is exceptionally important. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm glad I was able to join you. And there it is, 40 minutes. Take care.
Thanks, Bob Ray.
Hear me? Is he still here? Yeah. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray, for this very interesting talk. I think you've really given us a lot of food for thought over the next 2 days. I think it's always helpful to hear, at least from my perspective, a historical overview of where we are today due to the many things that have happened in the last decade. So thank you very much for being with us this morning. I think it's the second time that we've had a chance to host you virtually. I hope the next time will be in person. So I look forward to meeting you the next time you are in Ottawa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd love to join you. I'm getting used to these Zooms, but I would prefer to meet you in person as well.
Thank you.